All right, in chapter 3, we are going to be reading about theories on victimization. Of course, theories, and a lot of these, by the way, you will be familiar with from your other courses in criminology. But, we create theories because we want to try to understand and explain, in criminology, criminal behavior. When it comes to victimology, we want to try to understand and be able to explain why some individuals become the victims of crimes. And that's what these theories really are all about. So this might be a review for a lot of you from your other classes, but we start with classical criminology. Classical criminology kind of evolved out of the idea that people will engage in criminal behavior. And if we want to keep people's behavior in check, we have to create laws. So this goes back all the way to the 18th century with Cesare Beccaria. He suggested that all men are self-seeking and capable of committing crime, and that if a society wants to maintain social order, they have to kind of accept the idea that all men are capable of that and capable of antisocial behavior, and that we have to have laws in place and punishment if we want to be able to deter crime. If you look at our criminal justice system, even though it's, not fully Beccaria's idea, we do kind of take this approach with our criminal justice system. We have laws in place because we understand and know that people have free will and often engage in criminal behavior. And in order to control crime, we have to have punishment in place, which we have with fines and imprisonment. The positivist theorists assume, this one's interesting because the assumption is that behavior is based, at least partly, by biological forces. The early theorists that talked about the positivist view were interesting because they really kind of suggested that things like the shape of your head, the shape of your body, the shape of your head is called phrenology, by the way. The shape of your body, facial features, things like that would tell us who the criminals were. Now, of course, those theories don't make sense to us anymore, but biological theories still are popular today. The problem sometimes with positivist theories when we're looking at biological forces in terms of your heredity, your neurotransmitters, which are the chemical messengers in your brain, your brain function, is that people get uncomfortable with them because they think that we are suggesting that people are not responsible for their behavior because of their biology, and that's not true. But biology is really making a comeback in criminology with theories, particularly something like biosocial criminology, which looks at both your biology and social factors. But it's an interesting perspective, and definitely one that we still, even though we've kind of moved away from the original ideas, we still put a lot of interest in the role that biology plays in behavior. Psychological theories. Now, there are a lot of different psychological theories on behavior. In your textbook, just talks about a few of them. Sigmund Freud, you've probably all heard of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud believed that our behavior in large part is a result of our unconscious. He was kind of the first person to create a formal theory, formal scientific theory that suggested we have an unconscious and that it is responsible for a lot of our behaviors. He said that we have urges and impulses, many at the unconscious level, that kind of drive our behavior. Albert Bandura. Albert Bandura is the founder of social learning theory. And so he suggested with social learning theory that we learn a lot of our behaviors through what is called modeling or imitating other people. He also talked about cognitive appraisal of rewards and deterrence, suggesting that a lot of people think about, if I do this behavior, what's going to happen to me, and what's keeping me from doing these behaviors. Hans Eysenck. He was popular in the 1940s, and he suggested that extroversion, which is a personality trait, and neurosis, which means being high in anxiety, high in stress, even high in depression, contribute to criminal behavior. And then comes along Robert Hare. Robert Hare is one of the leading researchers on psychopathy. Psychopathy is a set of behaviors that often go along with criminal behavior. Being a psychopath, by the way, is not a clinical diagnosis in psychology or psychiatry. That would be antisocial personality disorder. But if you have psychopathic behavioral patterns, that would fall under the heading of antisocial personality disorder. And basically, psychopathic behavioral patterns means a person is kind of void of the ability to feel guilt, shame, or remorse. They don't have empathy for other people. They really don't care about what they do to other people or how other people feel. They don't have kind of normal emotions. So this is a really interesting theory, and definitely one that applies to a lot of criminal behavior. Theories that came out of sociology, you can see them defined here as social structural theories. These are looking at social factors and how social factors may contribute to criminal behavior. Strain theory by Robert Merton, very influential theory out of sociology. Merton suggested that people feel strain when they can't get the things that everybody values in any given culture. So, if you, for example, in our culture, today we value, having iPhones and certain types of shoes and certain types of cars and certain types of clothes and other types of electronics and certain types of earbuds. And not everybody has the financial means, the legitimate financial means to buy those things. Strain develops in pockets of our culture with people that don't have the legitimate means to buy those things. And it's really, when we look at the social factors, it's really the idea that we don't have equal access to things like jobs and education to allow everybody to buy those things. So that strain causes some people to engage in criminal behavior to get those things that we all value in a culture. So that's what strain theory is. Social control theory by Travis Hershey. This was actually developed, Hershey did a lot of work in juvenile delinquency. So this was originally designed to explain juvenile delinquency. And he suggested that juveniles who don't have social bonds to their culture will engage in delinquent and later on criminal behavior. So social bonds are things like, bonds to your family, bonds to your school, bonds to your church, bonds to your friends, interest in things like being in the band at school or being on a sports team, or having a musical instrument that you're interested in. Those things, to keep those bonds, to keep those things that you love, that exerts control over people. In other words, I want to toe the line because I still want to be able to play football. I want to toe the line because I believe in the message my parents are giving me or the message my church is giving me. So it's the idea that we're attached to something and it kind of keeps us in line. Labeling theory. Labeling theory is the idea that when you label somebody as a criminal or as a psychopath or as a delinquent, those labels, those kind of negative labels stick. And people start to believe those things about themselves. And it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Sorry, I've got a cat meowing back there. Hey. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, if you label a juvenile as a delinquent, people will start treating them differently because they think they're a delinquent. And they might start believing that about themselves, and they have this self-fulfilling prophecy where they'll start engaging in delinquent behavior because that's what everybody expects from them. That brings us to victim-based theories. Victim-based theories make people very uncomfortable because they suggest that because they believe that we suggest we are blaming the victim. They've been around for a long time. Here's some of the earlier ones. So it was really, they weren't developed to blame the victim. They were developed to help us better understand the phenomena of victimization, looking at different typologies. And typologies are kind of a classification system. So looking at factors like biology, sociology, psychology, demographic, psychiatric, all of these other things that could potentially contribute to somebody's victimization. So Mendelsohn in 1937 was the first person to come up with a typology, a classification system, and it was based on the responsibility for one's own circumstances that could potentially contribute to becoming a victim. Now, other people have kind of looked at that and found fault with it. Mannheim was one in 1965, said the distinction between victim and offender is vague, often blurred. Ellenberger said we need to focus on what he called victimogenesis instead of criminogenesis, which is kind of the etiology of criminal behavior, instead looking at the etiology of victims' behavior. So again, focusing on the victim. So here are Mendelssohn's 6 victim types. The completely innocent victim does not share any responsibility for the victimization. This is considered to be the ideal victim. It includes children and victims of random or rampage shootings, unexpected natural disasters, and anybody who suffers a crime while they are unconscious. A victim with minor guilt or responsibility due to his or her own ignorance. This can include things like adults who were victimized due to being in the wrong place at the wrong time. That will come up later again, by the way. Includes persons attacked walking on a dark street, suggesting that being on a dark street is something we all know we shouldn't be doing. Victim who is as guilty as the offender, a voluntary victim, and shares equal responsibility. So people who are victimized while engaging in risky behavior like buying drugs. Includes contracting something like a sexually transmitted disease from a sex worker, or seeking, challenging, or enticing the perpetrator, or being willing participant in, a gun duel, double suicide, things that are dangerous. Victim who is slightly guiltier than the offender. Someone who provokes or induces somebody to commit a crime, as an example, includes an abusive husband who is killed by his battered wife, cult members who choose to enter the cults as adults and were then brainwashed and harmed, like in Jonestown or Waco, Texas. A victim who is exclusively responsible for his or her own victimization, somebody injured while committing a crime. Includes a violent perpetrator who is killed by another person in self-defense, or a mentally healthy and competent individual who commits a rationally planned suicide. And these examples, by the way, are from the textbook and Mendelsohn. And the imaginary victim, the false accusation or allegations of sexual assault or any type of assault, really a crime that didn't actually happen, but somebody has kind of made themselves into a victim when they really weren't. Critique of victim typologies. The categories that we just looked at, further described by Zur, also judged the degree of guilt or responsibility from totally innocent to no guilt to 100% responsible. Zur cautioned that when you do that, these categories represent an attempt to differentiate among many situations or victimhood. And this particular Mendelsohn's 6 victim types didn't really do that. We need to look at other things, according to Zur, like cultural background, demographics, personal variables that may also contribute to whether or not somebody is at least partially responsible for his or her victimization. Now, another researcher named Hans von Hentig wrote a book, The Criminal and His Victim Offender, in 1948, and he offered a victim typology that explored the relationship between the victim and the offender. So there's a section in this book called The Victim's Contribution to the Genesis of Crime, and it had this particular typology that again is trying to make a relationship that we can understand between the victim and the offender. So the young, viewed as criminals as weak and inexperienced and vulnerable. The female described as another form of weakness and more likely to be victimized, just being female or being young. The old likely to be victims of things like property crimes because they've accumulated a lot of wealth. The mentally defective. Hentig described the mentally ill, intellectually challenged, and substance abusers as handicapped in any struggle against a crime. Immigrants are vulnerable while adjusting to a new culture and can suffer things like poverty, emotional difficulties, and rejection. Criminals often underestimate the immigrants' disturbed situation and take advantage of it. Minorities. The position of minorities is similar to that of immigrants in that they can be taken advantage of. They also don't have a lot of resources. Prejudice would also contribute to types of victimization with things like bias crimes. Dull normals. He said that these are people who are born victims and that criminal or swindler can exploit their vulnerability. So this is just even adults. So not talking about young or female or the old, just people that are a little slower maybe and more likely to become victimized. The depressed. He said that when a person has a depressed attitude, they are more likely to be submissive and become victims. The acquisitive, he described how criminal syndicates, racketeers, gamblers, confident men, and others exploit the victim's need for money. The wanton, this person is dimmed by the generalization of laws and obscured by social conventions. The lonesome and the heartbroken. He cites mass murderers as preying on this type of victim and gives the example of Jack the Ripper. These murderers take advantage of the loneliness of their victims. Tormentors, as he describes them as being in family tragedies. This type of victim is said to strain a situation to such a degree that he becomes a victim of the stressful atmosphere that he creates. And then the blocked. The blocked victim is a person who has been so meshed in losing situations that their defensive moves are impossible. He gives the example of somebody being blackmailed. Now, keep in mind, he created this in the 1940s, so some of these might sound a little sexist or outdated to us. But again, this is kind of an early typology. And again, looking at the victim and how their individual circumstances could contribute to becoming the victim of a crime. Now we have Schafer's typology. He was a criminologist who reviewed Mendelsohn and von Hentig's work that we just looked at, and he came up with what he called functional responsibility, and this was out of a book called The Victim and His Criminal. So his typology looks at victim precipitation. So unrelated victims. There's no responsibility. The victim was an unfortunate target of the perpetrator. Provocative victim. The victim shares responsibility and the offender is reacting to something that the victim did. Precipitative victims. Victim who leave themselves open for victimization by placing themselves in dangerous situations or settings. Biologically weak victims. Age or deficits place the victim at risk. Socially weak victims, for example, minorities or immigrants who are victimized because they have not adjusted to our culture. Self-victimizing victims, persons who are involved in crimes such as drug abuse, sex work, or gambling. And then political victims, persons who oppose those in power and are victimized to be kept under control. And again, these might sound like we are blaming the victim, and that's not what we're not. That was not the goal. The goal is to understand why some people become victims by looking at some of the circumstances surrounding the victim. All right, that brings us to interactional theories. Interactional theories consider the intersection between the victim and the offender and the environment. One of the most commonly cited interactional theory on victimization is lifestyle routine activities theory. This one is actually very influential. It was developed in the late 70s, and it proposes that certain personal characteristics and lifestyle choices increase a person's risk of victimization. So again, remember I said we were going to come back to walking on a dark street. So, or it could be with your job. If your job routinely puts you in dangerous situations, or if you walk on a dark street to work or home from work or home from class, those would be examples of your routine, your activities that are risky. Now, Fatah identified fear of crime as a factor that can also impact who's going to be victimized. He suggested that a lot of people are very fearful of crime, and that fear kind of keeps them at home. So that could be, based on gender, age, race, income, urban residence. So suggesting, for example, that a lot of women are very cognizant of the fact that sexual assaults happen in certain situations. And so women are less likely to walk in a dark parking lot or walk home from work after dark, or go out in the middle of a city very late by themselves. People that are older are more cognizant of the fact that they could be robbed, that their home could be burglarized, and so they take steps. So it's suggesting that certain people, certain characteristics make people more fearful of crime, and that causes them to behave in certain ways that actually influences whether or not they are going to be. Other interactional factors that have been talked about, Schafer talked about the idea of victim resistance, and this is the idea that victims who fight back or who are resistant can reduce their victimization. Of course, that's not always possible, and it's not always a great idea, but it has been looked at. Mutual violence or role reversal. This is the idea that a lot of people engage in reciprocal violence, and sometimes it's hard to understand or know who the actual victim is. For example, maybe you have a couple who is mutually violent towards each other. So they engage in verbal and physical violence, both of them towards each other. So we have mutual violence going on, and it can be hard to understand or know who the actual victim is in those circumstances. Stockholm Syndrome, this is a very interesting one. This actually came out of a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, where a man took hostages, and one of the hostages, a female hostage, became very attached to her hostage taker and eventually actually married him. So it is a unexpected alignment and bond that can be created between hostages and their captors. There's different things that have to kind of take place for this to happen. There can't be any violence. The hostage taker has to be, fairly kind to the person they're holding hostage, and the length of time that the hostage taking situation takes place. There was another case back in the 1970s of a woman named Patty Hearst who was kidnapped by an organization and held for a very long time. And then she actually participated in a bank robbery with the group. And she was eventually arrested and convicted. And some people suggested that she developed Stockholm Syndrome for the people that had taken her captive. Societal-based theories. Conflict theory suggests that crime is the product of whoever is in power. In other words, crime is defined by whoever is in power in any given culture. And who is in power is going to define what criminal behavior is. So, if two countries are fighting with each other, one wins, the new country now has the power, and so they can therefore define what is now criminal behavior. So something that wasn't criminal yesterday is now criminal. So it's the idea that cultures define what is acceptable behavior, what is criminal behavior, and that's what they mean by labeling. Marxist theory takes this a little bit further. Marxist theory suggests that this power struggle that goes on, the only way that it can really be fixed is with pure socialism, because Marxist was a socialist. And then feminist criminology looks at the role that gender plays with power and vulnerability, particularly with women as victims of crime. A lot of different theories under the idea, under kind of the umbrella of feminist criminology. But again, it's really kind of focusing on the role that just being female plays in power, in vulnerability to criminal behavior. Ecological theory. This one, this is very similar to a lot of theories that are in developmental psychology. Developmental psychology suggests that when you're looking at things that affect our development, you can't just look at the immediate environment. And that would be this right here. So here's the person. This is your personality traits, your biology, your brain function, the neurotransmitters. But that's not the only thing that is going to influence your behavior. We also have your immediate environment. That's called the micro. So your family, your peers, and then we have to look even further. We can't just look at your family and your friends to determine, and those would be considered social influences. So we've got your biology down here. Now we look at your immediate circumstances, but we have to look a little bit farther. And so applying this from developmental psychology to criminal behavior, looking at criminal behavior in terms of your personality characteristics, your biology, your brain function, looking at the influence of family, peers, your immediate environment. But we have to go out even further, look at the neighborhood that you grew up in, the city that you grew up in, the environment, the community, and then going out even further from that. What are the social attitudes? What are the policies? What are the laws? All of those things. So it's just the idea that we can't just, if we're trying to explain behavior, including criminal behavior, we can't just focus in on the individual and their personality traits. We have to kind of step out a little bit and also be willing to look at their environment, their immediate environment, the neighborhood, the community that they grow up in, the community that they live in, and then also the social attitudes, the social policies, the laws. All of those things can influence behavior. All right, so super interesting chapter. Go ahead and read the chapter. It'll go into more in depth with these theories. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a great day.